Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. Thank you for joining us. One of the reasons I love journalism and I love doing what I do is you get to ask either questions that you have no rights really to ask, or people that you have no right to ask either, about things that you don't know or begin to understand. And when AC Grayling's book, Anthony Grayling's book came out and we were sent a copy, we thought this is just an amazing opportunity to talk about a subject that we breezily discuss in newsrooms all the time. What do we know? In a way that we might consider in a wholly different register. And I got a copy here, The Frontiers of Knowledge. I think, am I right, Anthony? It came out just last week. It's just come out. And I should say, I absolutely love this book in a way that I'm afraid I'm going to just sort of go the full purple prose on it. I read about a couple of years ago now, Richard Power's book, The Overstory. You know, I don't know whether you read the novel. It's this wonderful novel about trees. And as the book goes on, you slowly realize what the book's saying, which is it's all about the trees. And in this book, the thing that's wonderful about it is you make the case, the argument, and then it's an amazing journey through the world, through history, through our understanding of ourselves, particularly the brain. And it slowly dawns on you that in everything you're telling us, and we learn so much, and I didn't know, but you're really learning about what you don't know. You're really learning about the scale of things that we don't know. And so in this hour, what we really hope to do is hear from you, understand what you mean by the frontiers of knowledge and the paradox of knowledge you talk about. But the reason that we were particularly delighted, or we asked and we're particularly delighted that Lucy Winkett, Reverend Winkett would join us, is that, of course, what do we do as humans in the areas where we don't know? And how do we think about that relationship between what we do and what we don't know? And we had actually, Anthony, one of our very first ThinkIns in Lucy Winkett's church, which was about a completely different subject, which was about, wasn't it, the modern meanings of faith and church. And so it's lovely to see you again, Lucy, and thank you for coming here. Once again, you didn't need to travel for this one either, so it's great to have you here too. Just to say, the idea of a ThinkIn is that everyone weighs in, so please don't hold back. If people have views, please do share what you think, and also the obviously, you know, thoughts. We normally have this rule, which is no questions, but it's silly, frankly, with Lucy and Anthony here, not to feel as though they're questions that can and should be asked. So please do weigh in. But Anthony, can I start by asking you that the book starts by setting out this argument about the paradox of knowledge, and I wondered whether or not, for those people who haven't had a chance to read it yet, you'll just set out what that is.
Well, the paradox of knowledge is that what we've learned from this extraordinary explosion of knowledge so very, very recently, just in the course of the last few decades when it comes to a better understanding of the brain and how it works, just in the course of this last century, really, in fundamental physics and in cosmology, and just in the last, well, since the second part of the 19th century, the reach of our historical understanding has become so much greater. So we've had this vast expansion of knowledge, and what it's taught us is how little we know. Because prior to that time, all advances in knowledge, all discoveries seemed to us to be chipping away at the domain of ignorance. So the more we learned, the less we were ignorant of. And now turns out to be completely otherwise. I mean, one very, very telling example is that with this extraordinary amount of scientific knowledge that we have now and its applications, I mean, here we are using the remarkable technologies that have flowed from the discoveries of science. We've come to realize that we know just a bit less than 5% of what the universe is. That is, we have access to 4.9% of the mass density of the universe, of the contents of the mass density of the universe. Over 95% of what constitutes the universe is hidden from us in the form of dark matter and dark energy. And this is one of the great discoveries of science, which has been so dramatic in these recent many decades, and so powerful in its applications. So I like to put it like this, just in conclusion, as a little illustration, that if the island of knowledge is growing, so the shoreline of the island is getting longer and longer. And we realize more and more that we know so little about the past and the world around us.
And actually, will you just define for us what knowledge is? Because you talk about scientific knowledge, and then I suppose what we more commonly think of as knowledge. So what's the distinction between those two things?
Well, again, it used to be thought that by knowledge we meant indubitable truth. If you know something, then what you know is true, and it can't be called into doubt. And indeed, the model that was always used in the past of the quest for knowledge was the progressive discovery of greater certainty, of really approximating the truth. And the comparison was with faith, with religious faith, absolute certainty. That is, there's no question about it, there's no doubting it. What we've learned, however, is that knowledge is a much more tenuous thing, that our best knowledge is in fact the most powerfully supported theories that we have and that we can premise in our further investigations, but always under the government of an important principle, which is the principle of defeasibility. It's a great word, defeasibility. It means that it's open to challenge, that better evidence, new evidence, stronger arguments might make us revise our theories or even indeed replace them.
And is everything, now I'm just going to show off here, is everything defeasible?
Well, in mathematics and logic, not, but because in those formal domains, you can actually get completely watertight deductive proof. But in everything else, everything contingent, everything to do with the empirical matters, the universe, contingency, there, that is what we have at very, very best, this defeasible set of hypotheses and theories.
But knowledge then, and as I understand from the book, is not, if you like, indisputable facts, but are a set of rationally provable beliefs. Is that a...
Yes, indeed, exactly right. Rationally, where the word rational that does a lot of work. It's a very interesting word because the first part of it is ratio, which means proportion. So what we accept as knowledge until something else comes along to show us that we need to revise it, extend it, add to it, change it, is proportional to, is rational to the evidence that we have in its favor.
And does just to take your fundamental point on the paradox of knowledge, how as we learn more, we've realized how little we know. There's a moment in the book you talk about the Renaissance man, the idea of the Renaissance, that suddenly there was a belief took over that eventually it would be possible to know everything, that there was a quest for knowledge that would be increasingly rewarding. What's the status of being human if your paradox is true, that the more we seek to know, the more we'll realize we don't?
Well, if one views it in the right way, well, one sees it as, in fact, an exhilarating and an exciting fact. Let me give you a little anecdote here which illustrates this, which is that a very good friend of mine is one of the senior scientists on the compact muon solenoid experiment at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, one of the people who worked on the Higgs boson discovery. And I said to him after the announcement, gosh, it must have been so exciting to be able to tell the world that this particle had been observed and that the standard model of the atom was therefore complete. And he said, yes, it was rather nice, but I have to say, he said, that had we not discovered it, there would have been so much more physics to do and it would have been really interesting. And the point about that is that the sort of open-endedness, the open texture of inquiry, the fact that every discovery generates more questions and that there's more work to do and that progress is discovering what the next discoveries need to be, that is very, very exhilarating. So instead of reaching closure, sort of drawing a line, signing off, tying up the loose ends, it's a question of enjoying the complexity and depth of things.
One of the things that's invigorating, actually really helpful in the book, is you at the very beginning of the book and then through the course of each of the 3 sections set out the obstacles to the process of inquiry. Because I think all of us actually can get with the idea that the journey of life is the business of inquiry itself, but you actually make clear that there are these sets of different traps that we can fall into. I don't know whether you wanted to go through all 12, but the ones that you think are the most significant, the ones that we're most liable to succumb to.
Well, one of the key ones actually is what I call the pinhole problem, which is that our view of things, of the very smaller scales of the universe and its very larger scales, of the depths of past time, even indeed of the tremendous complexity of the brain with its 86 billion neurons and trillions of connections, these are scales of things that we are really struggling to reach, and we need our very, very best imagining, our very best instruments and powers of hypothesis to try to find some way of making sense of them. So it's as if we're looking at the universe and indeed at ourselves, at our inner nature, through this tiny little pinprick in the fabric of things, a very limited, a very restricted and finite point of view. And that means that we're dependent upon our instruments, and our instruments will be a major factor in what it is we see. So I use the example, I think very familiar to a lot of people, that if your instrument is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, but maybe not everything is a nail. Or it may be that you only look for your lost keys under the street lamp because that's the only place that you can see them. Or it may be that when you inquire into something, the very act of inquiry itself changes the nature of what you're inquiring into. So you're not seeing the thing as it is in itself, but only as it is when it is observed. So all these are barriers to inquiry, which the good inquirer, and the science is the absolute paradigm of good inquiry, has to address and overcome.
I mean, what I had to, as I read it, I thought to myself, oh yes, I've succumbed to all of these. You talk about the map problem, mistaking the map for the lay of the land, the actual physical lay of the land, and definitely the pinhole one is one that resonated with me. And I'm going to do it now, if you don't mind, Anthony, because before I come to talking with and bring Lucy in to talk about religion and knowledge, I want to talk a little bit about journalism and knowledge. Because actually it's not the direction the book goes at all, but you will have been aware that you wrote a book at a time when a phrase like alternative facts, post-truth, all of these arguments that we've left our reliance on empiricism behind is something that feels very political, certainly very pressing in newsrooms. And there's this paragraph very early in the book that I underlined where you wrote, "The arts of persuasion, of redirecting attention, of magnifying or masking facts, of influencing and manipulating opinion are commonplace everywhere, from politics to advertising. And they all rest on the truth that, as Bertrand Russell once remarked, most people would rather die than think, and most people do. For alas, persuasion and manipulation are made to seem to matter far more than the effort to be truthful." And I wondered how you think about this, if you like, a kind of lofty analysis of the way in which our relationship with knowledge is meeting a recognition of ignorance and the deliberate manipulation of things that are untrue.
Well, look, the one very, very important aim indeed in the book is to try to persuade and to alert to a very deep need that lies behind what has unfortunately become a sort of cliche. The cliche in question is the gestures that everybody makes towards critical thinking, teach critical thinking at school and at university, help people to become skeptical in the right kind of way about what they're told or what they read, make them better evaluators of all the stuff that they meet with on the internet and so on. And this has become a sort of cliche. And when things become cliches, they thin out and people don't realize how fantastically important they really are. So one of the main aims really of the book is to say, of course, we must all of us have our areas of expertise, maybe one or two things in which we have genuine expertise, but we should also be literate across the whole board. We should be able to have an intelligent and responsible grasp of what's happening in all domains of thought and interest and inquiry, so that we can put things in context, so that we can be good contributors to the great conversation that we in our societies need to have with ourselves about how we're going to live and do things. So I've very, very much had in mind the fact that in our age, we've become a prey really to the barrage, the tsunami of opinion and personal belief, which anybody can publish on the internet now, and podcasts and blogs and the rest of it. And we don't take seriously enough the idea that we've got to be able to scrutinize it and see right through it. This is the stuff that Daniel Kahneman talks about, thinking fast and slow. Most of us, all of us, I think, at times are very prone to the fast thinking, to being quick, slick, shallow, trying to get, just accept the easiest thing to think and not digging into it. And digging into it is more important now than ever. And if I may, just one little anecdote which really, really illustrates the importance of this. Back in the day when Reagan was president of the United States, you may remember there was a suggestion about putting anti-ballistic missiles up in space to defend against a potential Soviet attack. In fact, it was just a bit of propaganda. But at the time, one Nobel Prize-winning physicist remarked, well, it doesn't bother me, he said, this was Steven Weinberg, it doesn't bother me that Reagan doesn't know science, but it does bother me that he doesn't know history and philosophy, because if he did, he wouldn't dream of escalating the arms race in this way. And it's that point about the connectedness, about the overall overarching way in which all the different things that we can think and debate about the world connect, which seems to me to be so important.
All right, well, let's get in. I want to ask Lucy what she thinks of the book. And Lucy, funny enough, when I was reading it, one of the thoughts I had was actually before lockdown, we had Jonathan Sacks, Rabbi Sacks, sadly died in the course of the last year, into our newsroom. And one of the arguments he made with our society was that we were very big on asking about what and how, which is one of the themes of Anthony's book, but didn't have a real space for why. And their arguments with religion, which we'll come to in a moment. But I wondered what you made of Anthony's idea of the frontiers of knowledge and how that accords to the way in which you see things.
I love the book as well, and I'll join you in your purple prose quite happily. What I loved about it was the sense of exhilaration actually about it, and I suppose I know we'll come on to this probably later, but I think Anthony wants to describe religion as a kind of perhaps a past and closed and certain form of knowledge that anyone sensible has kind of moved on from or moved through. I obviously would want to say something different about religious knowledge, but I had a set of questions which were kind of alongside the questions that Anthony's asking, which were to do with how do we know what we know, and perhaps another question is, how do we bear what we know? I think that how do we carry what we know? Because this explosion, the 19th century explosion in historical knowledge, 20th century explosion in scientific knowledge, perhaps the 21st century explosion in terms of our brain and our mind and neuroscience. How do we as an individual carry this knowledge within us, and how do we bear it? And I think I was just involved in an event this week about climate change, for example, and it was talking about the grief that people are feeling themselves because we know more as an individual now about the scientific reality of the climate emergency, for example, but as an individual that engenders not only a set of moral choices for you as an individual, whether you recycle your plastic, etc., but it also kind of it burdens you with this knowledge without the commensurate power to fix it. So there's this kind of God's eye view that you can persuade yourself into, that you can know all of these things without necessarily having the kind of parallel ability to sort the problem out as you have recently diagnosed it. And I think that's a difficulty for a kind of an individual who has that sense of exhilaration and inquiry.
Anthony, what do you think of that?
Well, I think that's Lucy's made a really interesting point there about the anxiety of knowledge, the burden of knowledge, and picked a very good example, which is the climate challenge that we face at the moment. I suppose my response would be, but then, of course, I'm inclined to be a bit utopian and maybe over-optimistic about these things, but that even if our initial reaction to learning something and understanding the nature of a predicament like the climate predicament at the moment might be one of dismay and anxiety, it is also not the end point, because one might be able to win through beyond that to recognizing what kinds of things can be done and what's necessary. In the case of climate change, we know that of course we should all play our part and recycle and so forth, but that individual action by itself is not going to solve the problem. It needs to be international, and therefore we need, as good citizens, to be working to get our government to ally with other governments and to really do what's necessary to make sure that the challenge is met. So there is a kind of responsibility there. Admittedly, it's a collective one, and as an individual member of a collective, it feels sometimes frustrating and hard, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. It's like the old starfish story. You know, we've each got to throw as many of the individual starfish as we can back into the sea, and that is something that, if we do it on the basis of what we've learned, can do something to address that kind of anxiety.
So, Lucy, sorry, you were going to say?
Yes, no, I was just, I think that's brilliant. And I think one of the things I would highlight is the line that Anthony draws between acquiring the knowledge and then that presenting you with a new set of moral choices, because you have this newly acquired knowledge. And I suppose one of the things that is difficult, and let's just continue with the climate emergency for a moment, one of the things that's difficult is that even when you have that knowledge, and even when it seems evident to 90% of people what probably should be done, there's a significant number of people who will be holding that knowledge, carrying it, and wanting not to do that because of other interests or other, other disadvantages that moral choice will bring them. So I think that the line between knowledge and morality, and the line between knowledge and the choices that you then make, is very problematic. And so I suppose one of the things that I would want to offer to put in that gap is, for example, religious practice, because then you can bear the knowledge, or you carry the knowledge, which enables you perhaps to make a better choice in the light of it.
So, Anthony, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, I did, because I think if we took a slightly different example, it might illustrate another aspect of how the moral questions arise out of the knowledge side of things. Think about what's happening in neuroscience at the moment. I mean, pretty well on the imminent horizon of developments in neuroscience, the possibilities of what are called brain chip interfaces, so implants in the brain that might be clinically very useful indeed in helping to control Parkinson's or epilepsy or mood, people who suffer from terrible depression, or even indeed helping with memories that are very distressing and cause post-traumatic stress. Now you can see that these clinical uses of this new neuroscientific technology would be wonderful, but you can also immediately see that they have malign or negative possibilities attached to them. I mean, mood control, thought control, control of memory, effacing or introducing memories by means of implants. In a dystopian situation, in a kind of Orwellian world, these would be awful things if they happen. And yet the possibilities of them are not science fiction possibilities. So my point about them would be that in thinking about how we are to manage them, what we should try to control in the way of those developments really depends upon knowing about them and having a good, sensible, intelligent grasp of them, not an anxious or frightened grasp of them, which makes us want to just stop them altogether, because to do that, of course, would mean to lose all the clinical advantages that might come from them. Now, there's an example of knowledge and the choices that we might make on the basis of the knowledge, which are very, very far removed indeed from needing some sort of whatever it is that religion could provide, maybe an overarching view of the good for human nature, perhaps, or a comfort or a relief from the anxiety of knowledge. But in this particular case, that there is a clear and well-defined set of choices that we need to make about the use of those sorts of technologies, but they're predicated on knowledge.
So I feel as though I want to get into the argument that's not even implicit in this book, it's explicit, between, if you like, the sort of two positions you hold. I'm rather embarrassed in this. I feel like I'm in the middle of a joke, a philosopher, a theologian, and a journalist walk into a bar, and what happens is I try to incite an argument where there is none. But the fact is that, Anthony, your book makes this case, right? It makes the case in the section on science that really treats religion as either peddlers of myths or, you know, born out of you know, historic kind of belief in the supernatural. And by the end of the book, you're pretty clear that, you know, knowledge is at odds with religion. And I think you write, humankind has passed from the certainties of faith to the uncertainties of knowledge, from faith to ignorance via knowledge, right? And you make this point that one of the things that distinguishes knowledge from belief, from religion, is that knowledge tends to be consistent. You know, things are provable. Religion, you know, God, a bit like ghosts, tends to be inconsistent. Ghosts can, you know, harm you, but nonetheless travel through walls. You make this argument quite well that it doesn't stack up, the case for religion. And so I wondered, Lucy, when you read it, at the same time as being exhilarated by, you know, the way in which Anthony thinks about religion, but thinks about knowledge, didn't you think, well, actually, this is pretty much a two-footed tackle on religion?
I wouldn't use that language, but I too wrote down that humankind has passed from the certainties of faith to the uncertainties of knowledge. And I think, I mean, like many critics of religion, to describe, and I suppose I'm speaking from within Christianity as the religion I practice, but I don't really recognize the description of religion that is then demolished in the argument. So for me, it's often a kind of straw man in itself. So for me, you know, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty. And I think there's a kind of, you know, there's one a theologian who writes about religious truth being a kind of dappled truth, that it's like light passing through the trees, that it comes and goes. It's not this monolithic set of doctrines and knowledge that is passed immutably down generations. It might look like that from the outside from time to time, and I fully accept that religious authority has been colossally misused in the past and still is in the present in some instances, of course, but that doesn't mean to say that religion in itself, just as scientific endeavor in itself, is necessarily detrimental to the pursuit of knowledge just because its authority has been misused in the past or is misused from time to time. So it's not really recognizing the exhilaration of theology, if I might put it like that, you know, the open-endedness, the reality that as much as you discover or as much as you kind of delve into the belief that you might have, the more you realize how much you don't know and how much you doubt. All of those things are very recognizable from within religion. And I mean, there's just one kind of, you know, rather one linguistic point, which I think helps illustrate this, that, you know, the Latin word credo, I believe, which starts the creeds, which are possibly some of the more contentious texts in, certainly in Christianity, because they set out what most people would say are impossible things to believe. Credo comes from two Indo-European words, in fact, which simply means to give over my heart. And Anthony writes about the heart as one possible carrier of knowledge in the book. So therefore, belief is much more allied to trust than it is to an intellectual assent to a doctrine. And I think if you couch religious practice, or indeed spiritual practice, in that way, then you can simply see it as much more of an adventure and an exploration, which is certainly how I would want to describe religion and the practice of religion in a community.
What do you think, though? I think, you know, when you spoke at the beginning, Lucy, about how do we bear what we know, right? And that really spoke to me, the idea of actually not ignorance, but impotence, this feeling of, you know, the world that we face. And you can immediately see how religion will speak to that particular problem. But Anthony has a phrase, I can't remember where it is, forgive me, Anthony, somewhere in the book, about God of the gaps, i.e., you know, we plug God in to explain to us the things that we don't know or don't understand. And over time, of course, those gaps have got fewer and further between. Do you think that that's a fair criticism of what's happened to religion in the last 1,000 years?
I think that religion and science has had a fractious relationship, not least because religious authority has been misused in trying to suppress the exploration of scientific knowledge. So I mean, we have to hold our hands up to that, but I think that it's possibly one of the most important conversations that should happen now. I don't mean a kind of simplistic rapprochement between scientific knowledge and religious knowledge, but a kind of grown-up conversation that certainly is happening in many places, and isn't this kind of binary opposition that is often kind of set up in public forums. So I don't quite accept that it's a fair description, the God of the gaps. And I think I would also even say that even if I were to accept, which I actually do, I accept Anthony's premise that the more we know, the more we don't know, God is getting bigger, not smaller, in that argument, because the vast amount of what we don't know, which a religious sensibility might call mystery, is expanding. Like the universe, it's not only expanding, but the rate of its expansion is accelerating. That's truly exhilarating.
Anthony, but I want to bring in Joshua Kearney in a second, and Tess Murray, my colleague Matt Dancona as well. But Anthony, what's your response to that?
Well, first, I think if you look at this from a different angle, so look at it from the point of view of the history of ideas overall, and the point I make in the book is that belief in the existence of agencies in the universe or in nature was indeed proto-science. I mean, our very earliest ancestors who thought about these matters had one tool available to them, which was their own experience as agents, as being able to make things happen, the causal origin of events in the world. Pick up a stone, throw it in the pond, it makes a splash, you did it, so the wind, the thunder must be done by an agency. So then the attempt to interact with these agencies and influence them or propitiate them, gave rise to observance and ritual and the like. So it's very understandable how that way of trying to get some kind of conceptual framework to interpret and make sense of the world would have arisen. Now, it seems to me that if you look at the history of thinking in the relatively young religions of the world, because in fact the older pre-Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions do think about these things rather differently, but in the young religions, for a very, very long time, the idea of faith, a theological virtue, believing, even in the face of counter-evidence, one of the great patristic writers said that to believe in the most virtuous way is to believe even though all the evidence is against you, predicates itself on the idea of doubting Thomas, blessed are those who have believed but without having seen, so making it a great virtue. And it's only, the goalposts on this really started to move after the 17th century when exploration of the world around us, the contingent world, showed that the room for the action of agencies, of supernatural entities in the universe was extremely limited indeed to those bits that we didn't understand, like the origin of life before Darwin, or the origin of the universe before the Big Bang Theory. And so, with very, very great respect indeed to Lucy, I think the way of describing what faith is now, not as committed belief, as acceptance of something as true and indubitable as part of what your commitment as a Christian might be, or as a Muslim might be, but instead as being something which itself is full of doubt and full of controversy, and thinking of this great discovery we've made that the oceans of the unknown are even larger than we thought that they were, as giving even more room for appealing to mysteries. That does seem in a sort of intellectual way, and again, with very great respect, to be disingenuous, because the kind of support that you could give for taking that sort of view, for the intellectual adventure that would involve, would be one that could be equally well met by, as it were, plucking from any tradition or any of the rich imaginings that humans are capable of to provide us with the thing that we don't understand, the thing which lies beyond the frontiers of knowledge now.
Lucy?
I mean, I think I'm also trying to say that I'm not claiming religion as a kind of comprehensive overarching set of a kind of, if I can call it, kind of scaffolding to explain the world. I just don't see religion. I don't really see religion in that way. I think those kinds of attempts to write doctrine and to impose those doctrines have happened in the past, but all of those attempts to control what people have believed have simply failed. And so it's. I suppose I'm also saying I'm not that kind of priest, but I absolutely accept that I'm part of an institution and part of a world religion that has made those attempts in the past. But I do think that there is a place for religious, or for a religious sensibility, and particularly the practice of ritual, I suppose, and I mean collective rituals, so not just individual spirituality, but a collective ritual. There is a way of us understanding how we know what we know in a different way that is not simply confined to an intellectual understanding or a discovery of a new fact. There are other types of knowledge. I can bear knowledge in my body that I'm grieving, for example. I can bear knowledge in my emotional life that's something is being revealed to me about my life, and it's being revealed in a kind of slow burn way. It's kind of unwrapping like the layers of an onion. I really do think that there are different types of knowledge that can be born only together and only in a practice of a kind of a collective ritual, which may or may not be religious and may or may not be focused on a deity beyond ourselves.
Is there, Anthony, just on this, is there a social place? I have to confess, I'm Jewish, and I have a soft spot for faith and religion, which I can tell you puts you in a pretty small minority in the news business. You know, they're not many of those, and it's often considered as rather quaint and laughable in me that I see that. But I can see the arguments for what some people might think of as myth, as in not factually true, but somehow speaking to a deeper truth. And I wonder what you think about that ideal. Is that silly, or does that have a meaning and a purpose to it?
Oh, I don't think it's silly at all. And I very much agree with you that we need stories. That's why we need literature, we need our poetry, we need the theatre, we need novels and so on, because these are all explorations of the nuances, the hidden corners, the depths, the possibilities that there are in human experience. So I think this is, I think, a really great reason why we do constantly tell one another stories, why indeed we all like gossip also. And you know what, I very much agree with everything that Lucy said, except sort of one dimension of it, which is, I mean, if I were permitted the word spiritual to denote the complex of my emotional and intellectual responses to the world, to nature, to beauty, to the people I care about, then I would say that the spiritual aspect of us is by far, in a way, the most important part of us. And indeed, I do think that collective observances of getting together and of singing and dancing together, I mean, these are the things that really do make us happy, because we are social beings and we need one another. We need our relationships and our communities. But the one thing that I don't see as essential to all that is that one must also believe that there are gods and goddesses, that to make any sense of it. On the contrary, I'm reminded of what David Hume said, that it is a fantastic thing about us, we human beings, that we are capable of appreciating beauty and of being kind and generous and loving to other people. You know, we so often hand over to the gods the good bits of us and reserve to us all the nasty things that we are. But this is something about us that we should celebrate and recognize.
Anthony, thank you. By the way, I should say I'm doing an absolutely terrible job at this, because I said we'd chat for 15 minutes and we'll start bringing people in, and then I've got more and more involved. So I'd like to apologise to everyone for that, and try and bring in as many people as possible now. I want to bring in Josh Kearney, if I can, because as I think when Lucy was describing a dappled truth, a phrase I suspect many of us are going to use in one form or other, probably not as intended, Lucy, but Josh was talking about the fuzziness of quote unquote truths in science. So Josh, what do you mean by that?
so I'm just coming to the end of my PhD in neuroscience, and I'm really learning that there is a fuzziness in scientific truths, lots of things that we accept more widely as fact, that there are angles to it. It is subject to our approach. And I'm interested in Parkinson's disease in a particular part of the brain, and I cannot tell you right now exactly what this part of the brain does, the basal ganglia. What I can do is try and communicate a sense of it. And that's what I've tried to do in my writing so far, is to try and capture some sense of this. But I have to accept and live with the fact that there is this huge, vast complexity to the human brain. And I think to accept that is to accept the whole truth and to be a bit closer to that whole truth. But it simultaneously means that there is difficulty communicating it in kind of simple factual truths that we kind of like to say, we like to think there are these nice, neat scientific truths.
And that the whole truth has an element of not knowing in it.
Exactly.
Josh, thank you. I'm going to, before I go to Anthony and Lucy to get a response, I'm going to get a few other points of view, if I might. I wanted to ask Tess Murray, I think, Anthony, when you were talking about brain-computer interfaces, Tess had made the point about ethics in embryology. Tess?
Yeah, sorry, I'm now completely miles away because we've had so many more interesting points since, but I was just making the point that we have a precedent for navigating sort of morally complex scientific advances and in the FHEA. And what I struggle with is the idea that we need a religious framework to have those conversations. I don't think we do. And I'm minded, James, to your point about faith. I mean, I was brought up hardcore Catholic. I haven't brought my children up in any faith. And it's quite interesting when we talk about the ritual and the coming together that sometimes I feel like I've, haven't given them what I had, even though I turned away from it. But I still know all the words and I still feel part of that community. And there is something comforting about it. But I have the most empirical children in the Western world, and getting them to have a faith is really interesting and challenging. But anyway, so my main point was we don't have to have a religious overlay to navigate complex moral scientific advances.
Yes, I'm going to take that. I'm going to put that to you in a moment, Lucy. But I'm also going to, if I might, I might ask Tom Schuler, because he's raised this point, a distinction. I suppose it builds on Anthony's point about the roles of gods in religion. Tom.
Well, it's just thank you. It's very simply about the extent of authority and a hierarchical authority. Who finally decides? And mine, I'm totally naive on comparative religions, but my understanding is it's almost a defining feature of religion that you have an authority that is regarded as finally superior to human experience and knowledge, and that really that's the essence of the disagreement between humanists like myself and I think Anthony, who acknowledge the spiritual side but don't acknowledge any authority sitting over us.
Anthony, Lucy, do you want to respond to that? Lucy first, if you would, your view of whether or not that's essential to the religious experience.
Yeah. I suppose, I mean, there's a huge amount to say, of course. I guess what I would say, and I can only speak from within Christianity, and I'm not going to presume to speak for all religions, of course, that would be ridiculous. Within Christianity, I think an orthodox theological position about God would be that that God exists clearly in that framework or in that understanding of the world, that God is utterly other, that God is utterly mysterious, and but is not necessarily, in my language, I wouldn't want to say that God is at the top of some pyramid at which human beings are a kind of large, kind of scrabbling mass at the bottom. That there's in contemporary theology, there's a much more I hesitate to use the word mutual, but there's a much more symbiotic relationship between divine and human. And certainly in Christian Orthodox theology, that this, presence that we call the divine is emptied. I mean, there is part of the nature of God is that God is emptied into the world, is self-emptied, so is therefore confined and restricted by human by the boundaries of human understanding. So it's not that if I think it's simplistic to assume that I, as a person of belief, will, as an adult, sit and ask God what I should do next, or that's kind of a question that I might ask a teacher or a headmaster. The way of interacting in terms of prayer, in terms of contemporary Christian theology, is absolutely not that. At the same time, God is utterly other. So moving to the question, do we need that to navigate complexity? No, we don't. I would want to offer religious practice and spiritual practice as an enriching and a deepening, exploratory and adventurous way of living, which deepens our appreciation of paradox and truth and helps us bear the knowledge that we carry anyway. But absolutely not. It's certainly not a coercive. I guess there's a bit of persuasion in there because I think it's a wonderful way to live, but I certainly wouldn't kind of state that it was absolutely essential. Not at all. It's very important in Christianity. Everybody has the freedom to say no at any point, walk away.
Thank you. But Anthony, can I ask you to address a different point, which was Josh's point about the whole truth involving a portion or an element of not knowing?
Yes, indeed. And in fact, that Josh's point connects actually with Tom's point as well about what has authority over our thinking and our inquiries. There is a really interesting connection there. I think one aspect of what Josh is implying is the fact that we work to our best lights. So the point at which theory has arrived at any moment is what our most rigorous and vigorous efforts to understand the phenomena we're investigating have yielded to us. And complexity is not an excuse for saying, well, we can just jump to some view about what might underlie it or explain it. We have to accept it, but nevertheless, there are certain things that we can do with it. So, helping to control Parkinson's symptoms, for example, would be a tremendous result, even if we didn't quite yet understand how those structures in the brain are really responsible for it or what's gone wrong with them. So there's always the sense that you're on a journey, that the destination recedes ahead of you, but in interesting ways, because it consists in a number of different questions. And this is where Tom's point about authority comes in. And that is, the authority to which you're yielding is the authority of reason, the authority of the evidence that comes out of your best efforts to test the hypotheses you're working with. It's the authority, as it were, of the data over you and the logic of your interaction with that data. And so it's an epistemic authority, not a person or a personal authority or a divine authority, or indeed the authority of some institution which tells you what you must think or do. Think about China during the Great Leap Forward, when Marxist, Leninist Mao Zedong thought made more rice grow than if you didn't have that thought. That's that kind of authority. Mm-hmm. So it's really epistemic authority which is at issue here.
Thank you. I'm going to try in the last 10 minutes just to address a couple of practical things. Education and information. I wanted to come to my colleague Selina Swift and also another colleague, Matt Dancona. Selina, you had a point about how we learn, and I just wanted to hear what that was. And Matt, I want to come to you about truth.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'd be really interested, Anthony and Lucy, to learn of what you think, I'm really interested in, I'm a media researcher myself with a philosophical background, and I'm looking at how journalists use probability to decide what's newsworthy. And someone mentioned in the chat about probability, I think it was Caroline. And I think we do sort of, as humans, tend to do these little small calculations in our heads discover and for ourselves, what we think is true or what we want to believe in. So as part of that, from a practical point of view, news is obviously a massive way that we learn about the world, and religion's also a form of how we learn about the world. So I'd be really interested how you both think, or in particular, the role that media, the role that news plays in how people learn about the society that they're in, because that's obviously, it comes across and is something very different across different societies in the world. And part of that could be because they have different media systems. So yeah, I'd be really interested to learn, how do you think news impacts our knowledge formation?
So, Selena, thanks. And Anthony and Lucy, before you answer, I'm just going to ask Matt, if I can, just to bring in, because Matt, you tackle this problem in a totally different way in your book, Post-Truth, and actually in your more recent one, Identity, Ignorance, and Innovation. I just wondered what you think our sort of everyday relationship with knowledge, facts, and truth might be.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, I love Tony's book, and I'm interested in the extent to which he thinks it's an intervention in a war zone, because certainly that's what it feels like to me. I mean, if you take the three categories of facts, truth, and knowledge, as James said earlier, on facts, we know that we are up against a kind of tsunami of alternative facts and social media-driven conspiracy theories and untruths. Then the broader category of truth, we have there's an entirely separate debate in which the notion of the truth is being constantly challenged by the idea that everyone has an individual truth. It's been, as it were, delegated to the individual, your truth, my truth, and a very emotionally driven argument about the validity of each person's truth. And then in the final analysis on the question the book is really about, which is knowledge. I'm interested in the extent to which you worry about the real attack on the scientific method, because it seems to me that one of the things that the oddities of contemporary society is that ideas take a very long time to move from the academy into the mainstream. And one of the things we've seen in the last 10 years is a kind of postmodern relativism that doesn't necessarily have as many fans as it used to amongst actual scholars, sort of bleeding into the mainstream of digital and offline life, to challenge the idea that we can know anything, and that then is acting in tandem with the growth of pseudoscience and the idea that one can't trust experts, and add to that the idea that the scientific method isn't actually science, but is only Western science and has dubious imperialist connotations. So you have this tremendous multi-front battle against the Enlightenment view of all the above. And I'm interested in the extent to which how great do you see the challenge?
Anthony, why don't you go first, then I'll come to you, Lucy.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think these are all extremely interesting points here. And the thing I think to remember is that there has been a transition. We've moved from thinking that the destination for inquiry is getting a truth which, once we've secured it, can be put in the back pocket and forgotten about because it's not going to be revised. It's just, it's white, and that's the end of it. What we've discovered instead is that knowledge isn't a body of settled and finished truths, but is a growing, accreting, self-modifying, self-testing set of theories, which, by the way, need to have extremely powerful support to be theories. The concept of a theory in science is something much, much more rigorous than the idea of a hypothesis, which is a kind of educated guess. But a theory is something you can premise in your further inquiries. You can use it as a platform for making further progress. And therefore, if you have to revise it or change it or add to it, that is a big thing. It matters. We can treat truth, the idea of truth, as an ideal of inquiry. We would love to get to the truth about some domain of affairs. I think it's the kind of characteristic philosophical error to think that there is something, the truth, which is just the truth all by itself for everything. You know, there is truth in mathematics, there's truth in biology, there's truth in ethics and so on. And what counts as truth in those things depends upon the methods that we use to arrive at it. And the methods that we have at the moment, and which have been so incredibly productive and fruitful, show us that we're very far from ending the trajectory of inquiry towards that. So knowledge has become something else. Knowledge has become our very, very best attested theories that we can use. We can use them as a basis for action. We can use them as a basis for further inquiry. So it's changed the nature of knowledge, and it's made us much more responsible about the nature of inquiry itself, and told us about what kinds of helpful skeptical questions we must ask about our processes of acquiring knowledge in order to be moving in the right direction. And it's against the background, and this is my final point, against the background where when people talk about my truth and your truth, what they really just mean is my opinion and your opinion. Yeah. And the question that one has to ask is, well, what reasons do you have for holding it? What evidence have you got for it? And we have to remember, very, very often when we ask people why questions, why did you do this? Why did you vote that way? Why did you, people treat a why question as a question looking for reasons. And the great majority of people, for the great majority of time, don't have reasons for what they do. They have feelings, which is one reason why religion still exists.
Anthony, thank you. I wanted, Lucy, just you to respond to Matt's point, Anthony's point, also Selina's point, particularly about truth and the media. I think when we first met, I came to you, I'm going to get this story wrong, to tell you something about knowledge and memory, that we talked about the difference between, if you like, religion and journalism in answering the question, what time is it? And I think you said that newsrooms have just the minute hand to work off, and
even the second hand. Yeah, it's like trying to understand the world by listening to the news is like trying to tell the time by looking at the second hand on a clock. Right. It's accurate, but it's exhausting. It won't tell you the time. And at its best, religion is trying to say, why don't you look at the hour hand? It's no less contemporary. It's no less accurate, but it's moving at a different pace. So. Yes, I mean, and in that sense, the minute hand, the second hand, and the hour hand all need one another, of course, to be able to more accurately dissect and understand perhaps what time it is. I suppose I was also, so I mean that's in terms of my view of how the media works or how news works in terms of helping us understand what's happening. But I suppose I also think there's something quite human underlying this discussion, which is fear. I think we flee towards certainty because we just can't handle the amount of uncertainty that there really is about living and the prospect of death, our own death, the uncertainty of what happens to us after we cease to exist on this planet. I think that we can, if we're not careful, and I'm using the word advisedly, flee. I think it's a drivenness to try to find something to set our feet on. And that can lead us to believing in all kinds of conspiracy theories, or indeed can lead to bad religion, which teaches you false certainties. And I repeat, I absolutely, religion is not in the business of peddling certainties. It may have tried to do that in the past, but that's bad religion. Good religion is about helping us to live with what we don't know and how we bear the knowledge that we have. So I offer it as one way of exploring this kind of portal in the universe that is the pinhole problem that Anthony identified.
Lucy, thank you, and Anthony too. I wanted to say that usually when you come to a ThinkIn, often on subjects that, if you like, are a little bit more kind of right in front of you than this one, you try to kind of pull it together at the end with, if you like, an editorial line. I wouldn't begin to try that. I would just say this, that firstly, I'm enormously grateful because I feel as though I've walked away with a group of home truths, things like phrases that I've not heard before that I know that will stick with me. I loved Anthony's phrase of "we work to our best lights." I loved your phrase, Lucy, of dapple truths. I was really struck by. We'll need to think more about the opposite of faith is not doubt, but certainty. I'm enormously grateful, Anthony, for the very simple cut through on this big debate in journalism about your truth, my truth, that's simply your opinion and my opinion, and you've got to find out whether there's a reason for it or a feeling. And I am struck too by this idea of fleeing towards certainty. I definitely know that that's certainly a feeling that resonates with me. But I wanted to end actually by the point that you make at very, very end of the book, Anthony, which I found really, really affecting, because when we started Tortoise, someone said, you know, what you really want to do here is you're heading into a new frontier in the 21st century, and the best that the journalist can do is just hold up a lantern and look out and see whether you can illuminate a little of what's in front of you. And you write this at the end: the great thing about a frontier, so different from a boundary, a border, a wall, is that it is an invitation to travel across it and travel onwards and to travel prepared. And I just thought it was just a fantastic invitation to look at what we know and what we don't know. So a huge thank you to you, Lucy Winkett. A huge thank you to you, Professor A.C. Grayling. Do get a chance to have a read of this. As you can tell, there's a lot to learn from it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm sorry we can't stand around and talk longer. I suspect we'd have much to discuss, but have a very, very good evening. Thanks so much.